So, chapter 2, verse 1, Nahum. And now, rhetorically, the city is addressed. A scatterer has come up against you. Guard the guard post. Watch the road. Brace yourselves. Marshal all your strength. For the Lord is about to turn the pride of Jacob as the pride of Israel. That's quite a complicated thing. I've forgotten what I think about it. I would need to read my book to know what I think. For devastators have devastated them and ruined their shoots. And then he goes back to Nineveh. The shields of his heroes are colored red. His mighty warriors are dressed in crimson. Flaming red are the coverings of the chariots on the day when he makes ready, and the cypress trunks are being shaken. So we get a picture of the opposing army making ready with 3 times red. I mentioned that to someone that has caused me a bit of problem. Translating 3 words of red into red, English, red is red, as far as I'm concerned. I'm not really terribly knowledgeable about colors, but you have to decide what kind of red, and so I needed to do a bit of research into what kind of red it might be. So I decided that the mighty warriors are dressed in crimson, and flaming red are the coverings of the chariots, rather than blood red. And so that's where the translation relates to the meaning as well. Why are those shields red? Is that because of the battle, or the blood there, or not? And I decided not. If that word that's used there refers to a different shade of red, the flaming red. So this is before the battle. Make ready. Of course, the opening here is ironic. Watch the road, praise yourself, marshal all your strength, because none of that will help. They will be conquered. But Nineveh was not terribly fully prepared. Here you got a picture of Nineveh. You got a long wall. But looking at it, the archaeology, we've seen evidence of something that, in fact, Nahum mentions later on. I think I've forgotten where that was. That they are quickly reinforcing the wall, because these walls were meant to be impressive. They were meant to signal the strength of Nineveh. They were not meant really to guard against an army, because they didn't expect that the army would ever get as close to that. So there was some quick reinforcement that had to be made. The enemies are getting ready. The cypress trunks are being shaken. So maybe their spears are like cypress trunks already. And then through the streets, the chariots rush madly. They race each other through the plazas. So that's the chariotry of the Assyrians. The Assyrians were known for their chariotry. And of course, having chariots in the city makes no sense at all. They can't fight properly, so they need quickly get out, but they're not succeeding. It looks like torches, like lightning, they dash around. He remembers his officers, they stumble in their goings, they hasten to a wall, so they run to the wall, but the siege towers have been set up already. So it's a picture of chaos in the city as the enemy approaches, and of being always a step too late. They come to the wall, and already the siege towers have been set up. The gates of the rivers are opened, and the palace collapses. That's the first image. Here we've got one artist's impression of Nineveh, because let me just go back again to this. So the Tigris is down here. Nineveh is usually said that is on the Tigris, and it is because the Tigris is a big river. But actually there was a smaller river, the Kosa River, that runs through the city. And that's what the gates of the river are, the sluice gates. They're at the walls. They are being opened, and suddenly the waters floods the city, and the palace collapses. Water is of great significance. in the ancient world. In that part of the world, it's a very precious commodity. These calm waters are a sense of order. And here another artist's impression, because you will have heard about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, I imagine, one of the 10 world wonders. Now, Stephanie Daly has argued, quite convincingly, I think, that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were actually in Nineveh. There was some misunderstanding in antiquity that attributes them to Babylon, but the archaeological evidence is there in Nineveh for such gardens, and they may have looked something like this. So those hanging gardens, they need a lot of water. And in fact, the Assyrians had an incredible water system. I was fortunate when I did this research on Nahum that there happened to be a conference of Assyriologists, people who make it their life work to study Assyriology. And they were focusing on Nineveh in a big conference in London. They're coming to my town and talking about Nineveh, I better turn up and find out. And it's amazing what I learned and the stuff they do with satellite imagery. They can retrace the canals that the Assyrians built over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, bringing waters from the mountains to the city. Because the Assyrian kings like to have exotic flowers, and they like to have a zoo, and it all needs water. And so water is a symbol of the order that Assyria brings and the way they are able to control natural forces for their own good. Here you've got an image of the palace. The palace collapses, a beautiful palace, and suddenly that whole system of governing what the rivers are doing and the many canals they run through, water everywhere, and the order is gone. The palace collapses. In verse 8, Nineveh, like a pool of waters since her days, which I interpret as, ever since Nineveh became a prominent city, it was a city that was known for the way it manages its water system so beautiful. A pool of waters, but they are running away. The waters are running away. It's all falling apart. Stop, stop! But no one turns around. There's no end to this. And as we are in the picture show, we've got a picture of, that's in the British Museum. These were symbolizing the creatures, the supernatural creatures that were meant to guard the palace. They are huge. As you can see here, they're taller than I am. And they're these winged creatures, like a sphinx, but a little different because they're not lions. And they were there for protection. Well, there's no protection here against the Lord. And here is one of the city gates that was reconstructed later. So that's what it looks like now, or at any rate, what it looks like before ISIS came. So the first image is of a pool. And that image is used, a pool whose waters run away. That image is used because water is a symbol of the order that the Assyrians brought. The control they brought to not only the natural forces, but to all the other forces as well. And that order, because it's an order without reference to God, is a corrupt order. It's a self-serving order. They create this order in order to get the most out for themselves. And that order is therefore going to be dismantled. And that water chaos everywhere is a sign therefore of chaos. That's throughout the Bible. Water has these two different sides. If it's a river, then it's a sign of provision and order. the river that runs through, well, not much of a river, trickle, but it's called a river in the Bible. It runs through Jerusalem. But the sea, in particular, the masses of water, is a sign of chaos. And so the river here and the canals and the pool, all nicely ordered water, turns into chaos, into flooding. And from that, a number of people have concluded that Nineveh was destroyed by flooding. But Nahum is not a military reporter, and his interest is not in telling us what means the Babylonians used to conquer Nineveh. And even he uses an image, and the Babylonians use that same image, but it's not actually how they destroyed the city. We can be, I think, pretty confident now archaeologically that it wasn't through water that the city was destroyed. Although it is possible that the Babylonians dismantled some of the cities and did a bit of symbolic flooding, because they too had this conceptual world in which floods stand for chaos and eradicating someone else's order. So they may have done that, but more in a symbolic way than in a literal way. Not as a military strategy, so to speak. And so here that's one image. Plunder silver, plunder gold. There's no end to the stockpile. Now the enemies are coming in. Wealth, more than all precious objects. Desolation, destruction, and devastation. Trying to imitate, like many translators do, the Hebrew wordplay there. Fainting hearts and knees that totter. There's trembling in all loins, and all their faces are flushed with fear. Where is the dwelling place of the lions and the feeding ground of the young lions? Where the lion went, the lioness was there, the lion cub, and none to frighten them. The lion was tearing enough for his cubs and strangling for his lionesses. He filled his holes with prey and his hiding places with torn flesh. This all looking back. But where now is the dwelling place of the lions? Why lions? Lions are of huge symbolic significance too in Assyria. If I had more time to prepare, I would have prepared a better presentation with different pictures for lions, because there are lots of pictures of lions to do with the Assyrians in the British Museum, because the lion was a symbol of the Assyrian king. And the literal lions that sometimes threaten a village, strictly speaking, only the king was allowed to kill them. And they did that in a very symbolic way, which I think is slightly ridiculous in a way. So only the king is allowed to kill the lion, but of course you don't want the king to face the lion. That's a bit dangerous. So the lion gets drugged and gets wounded and so by others, and then the king is brought along to put a death knell and so, because only the king is allowed to kill the lion. But he does it in relative safety. But the pictures, that's the way how the Assyrian kings portray themselves as great lion hunters and great lions themselves. And so God is turning that picture on himself, the picture that speaks of their authority, of being in charge. No, you're not. Where is the lion? Where's the dwelling place? The lion is unable now to hold on to his prey. It's a false authority, because authority without reference to God is self-serving and arrogant. So this second image on which I focus after the pool, the lions, is an image of authority. The water is the image of order. So the order that the Assyrians bring is dismantled, and the authority that the Assyrian king claims for himself is dismantled. And that's why it's the male lion lunging here. when particularly in Africa you might be more familiar with the lioness doing the hunting, but the Asiatic lion that is more prevalent further to the east, or was more prevalent. Now, of course, the Asiatic lion is, there's only a few left in India, and then, of course, in various zoos. So it's very difficult to observe their behavior in the natural, but they do hunt as well, I discovered. I mention that because in many commentaries you read on Nahum, they would say, well, that's a mistake because the lioness does the hunting, not the male grown-up lion. But that's true for the African lion. It's not true for the Asiatic lion. And the reason for that is that it's a different environment. The male lion is too heavy to go hunting a gazelle on the plains. So the lioness does it, who is more nimble on her feet. But in the Jordan thicket, for example, in places where the male lion can hide and has the element of surprise and doesn't have to do a lot of running, the male lion can be a successful hunter too. And for the allegory here, it's important that it's the lion, the Assyrian king, the male lion, that is doing the hunting, that is meant to be doing the providing for the lion cubs, providing protection, none to frighten them. But it's all gone. Where are they now, those lions? And then the next imagery, look, I'm against you, utterance of the Lord of hosts, and I will burn up your territory into smoke. And a sword will devour your young lions, combine those two images, and I will entirely cut off from the earth your prey, and no more shall be heard the voice of your messenger. So chariots, as I said, were also particularly symbolic for the Assyrians because their success related to the way they were using chariots. In the beginning, anyway, at this time, towards the end of the Assyrian Empire, they were using chariots less often. They have developed different strategies. They we're beginning slowly. It comes with the Babylonians then that they start to have riders instead of chariots that are even faster. We come to see that in Habakkuk. But the chariots, you think Assyrians quite readily. And so burning up the territory in the smoke is burning up that symbol of Assyria, but also chariots as a symbol of their resources and their strength. Remember, even verses in the Bible, do not put your trust in princes, do not put your trust in chariots. We read, so chariots are the hardware. Do not put your trust in tanks, but put your trust in God. The chariots go up in smoke, they are no longer of any use. So this image speaks of the resources. Trusting in one's own resources no longer possible because God is burning up those resources. And so he will cut off their prey, which means all those who suffered, including Judah, as the prey of the Assyrians will be released, and no more shall be heard the voice of your messenger. Again, the messengers, a sign of their control, that they have their ambassadors everywhere who tell people what to do. No, not anymore. Got a picture here, I think, of how this happened. So you've got a map of the ancient world, Assyria, just off the center of the map. And then, does that bring in the different... yeah, it's moving. So this shows us the Assyrian Empire, pretty much at its height, including control over Egypt even. But then we've got the first battles in 732 that aren't going so well. 722. Oh no, this is the advance of the Assyrians. 722, you might remember, very significant date, the end of the Northern Kingdom. 701, very significant date, nearly the end of Jerusalem. The Old Testament mostly celebrates the deliverance of Jerusalem, but actually Judah was devastated at that time. Lachish and other sides, it was a great Assyrian success, except that they couldn't conquer Jerusalem. That was a miracle. Now, of course, the Assyrian propaganda sounds different. The Assyrian propaganda doesn't say we laid waste to all of Judah, and then we decided that we didn't really bother about Jerusalem. The way they explain the fact that it didn't conquer Jerusalem is saying, well, I shut Hezekiah up like a bird in his cage. But I try to put a positive spin on the siege that actually was unsuccessful. By focusing on the siege itself, Hezekiah being unable to defend his country by being imprisoned like a bird in a cage in Jerusalem. That's one way of looking at it, and there's some truth in that. But the other way is the miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem at that time. And it's by 671 that they're moving into controlling the Nile Delta, Upper Egypt. And Nineveh was, I've forgotten why I had those images here, but we might as well use them now. Nineveh was at that time kind of the control room of the Assyrian Empire. And in that palace, where you've got towards the entrance those scenes that are here reconstructed in the painting, what is left of it are scenes like this. So the color's all gone. But here you've got people playing instruments, but being led by the guy at the back to move forward. And then we've got the more brutal imagery. Look at this. This is from the Lachish relief. So besieging and then destroying Lachish to the south of Jerusalem. People being stretched and stuff, and so naked there, the Judahites. People being impaled. See, it was up in the middle, the three people being impaled on sticks. An image of the approaching Assyrians, typical Assyrian headwear, so you recognize them there, the burrows. So no wonder that you want God to be avenging towards that and a stronghold. So on the one hand, you've got those pictures that portray the vast power, the extent of the empire, and the extent of the control of the Assyrians. And these are the pictures you see in Nineveh itself. And on the other hand, you have Nahum deconstructing it and say, look, Nineveh is really like a pool of waters where the waters are running away. Nineveh is like a lion, but it's going to be like a lion who doesn't find his prey anymore. And Nineveh has those beautiful chariots, but they're going to go up in smoke. So it's trying to deconstruct that, as a way of saying that the Lord is indeed a stronghold for his people. He is slow to anger, but abounding in power. This is where Nahum manipulates Exodus 34. And because he shows his power against this powerful force. But we've been in chapter 1, so I'll skip those and just see what. Oi, the city of bloodshed, all of her falsehood, full of blunder, prey does not cease. Oh, we're suddenly back to prey. And at first, not entirely clear what we're talking about. If you had it as an independent oracle, You think, city of bloodshed? Which is the city of bloodshed? It's actually a term used for Jerusalem a few times. Could be a destruction of Jerusalem, but of course in the context of the book, there's little doubt that it is still Nineveh being addressed. Sound of whip, sound of rattling wheel, horse galloping, chariot jolting. So we're back to the war scenes. Cavalry charging, placing sword, lightning spear, multitude of slain, mass of corpses with no end to the bodies. They stumble over their bodies because of the multitude of the harlots' harlotries. Graceful beauty, lady of sorceries, she who sells off nations for her harlotries and clans for her sorceries. Again, very clever, I think, how the poet gives us a sense of the frantic activity in the city with these very short units of lines, sound of whip, sound of rattling wheel, horse galloping, chariot trolling, you go back and forth. And then adding the more explanatory, contemplative way, because of the multitude of the harlots' harlotries. Behold, I am against you, we read again, utterance of the Lord of hosts, and I will strip your skirt over your face, and I will show nations your nudity, and kingdoms your shame. I will throw filth at you, and declare you contemptuous, and make you just like a spectacle. And it shall happen that whoever sees you will run away from you, and say, Nineveh is ruined. Who will grieve for her? Where can I find comforters for you? Using again the root for Nahum, comforter. And Nahum kind of saying, I'm not one of your comforters. Yeah, I'm quite happy with seeing this. But that's going pretty far. So we've had this imagery that I think makes more sense to us once we have the background. Yes, the pool of water speaks of the order, and the waters flowing away speaks of the end of that order. The chariots speak of the resources that Assyria had at their disposal, and they're going up in smoke, shows that their resources come to an end. We have the king, the authority that the Assyrians exercised, and the king can't find his prey. Yeah, that makes sense. Why do we need, in addition, this very stark image of Nineveh, the city, and you see it's going back and forth between the city and the king, the city as a harlot, and the quite explicit description of her punishment. This is something that will get people worried, certainly in the West, and I imagine here as well. I had a phone call with someone just a few days ago, last week, who is writing some Bible study material or pre-reflection material for Bible study notes on Nahum and Obadiah, and I think his pastor said, oh, Nahum, I know someone who knows something about Nahum. Why don't you get in touch with Thomas? And he hadn't done much study on Nahum yet. And I was just asking him, what are the kind of questions you have? And what are the things that you're thinking about? And this was prominently there as one. What are we to do with this very negative language about prostitutes? We are usually thinking in the West, I imagine it might be here as well, of most sex workers, prostitutes, as on the lower class offense, and trying to make ends meet, and wondering whether it is really right to criminalize them, or whether we, like Sweden and so on, should criminalize those who use prostitutes instead, and so on. So there's a greater sense of the vulnerability of prostitutes, and even having pity for them. How can that be an image for Assyria? And one answer is that we're not dealing here with kind of an ordinary prostitute, if there is such a thing. And Nahum alerts us to that. We're dealing with not even with a high-class prostitute. There are, in the West, some consorts, and I think there's a long tradition in Egypt, for example, as well, so I imagine in Ethiopia as well, of some kind of high-level prostitutes who sometimes can become quite prosperous, and they are often singers and dancers as well, and have close relationships with the rich and the famous and the powerful, and become known like that. Nineveh is a bit more like that, not a low-class prostitute who can't find a decent job, has a few kids to nourish, and then finds no other way of making money than go on the street, but someone who earns quite a lot with it. But she's even worse than that. She who sells off nations for her harlotries and clans for her sorceries. Because obviously the whole point about the prostitute is that you pay her for her services. But Nineveh is even worse than that. She pays those who use her for the prostitution. So clearly, she's not portrayed as an ordinary prostitute. So why if she's such a different prostitute, why even use that imagery? It is something to do with the enslavement, I suppose, which comes with the sorceries as well, enslaving her customers, so to speak, making them dependent on her. But more important for Nahum still is the gap between appearance and reality. You get it all over the world in all sorts of other contexts. But with prostitution in particular, you have very obviously that profound gap between appearance and reality. What people want is love, true love. And of course you don't find that with prostitutes. It's completely fake. And so there's graceful beauty, they make them lots of makeup and stuff, but it's not real. It's not a real love relationship. And it's that aspect that I think Nahum wants to focus on here. The prostitute has to be publicly humiliated. That's why we've got this stark image of the humiliation of Nineveh in the image of that woman being stripped the skirt over your face so you see everything. I'll throw filth at you, declare you contempt as a spectacle. That public humiliation is a way of saying, I will not allow any illusion of the falsehood or the pretense that was behind the Assyrian Empire to stand. It will all come out in the open. So it's a very powerful, it hits you the stomach kind of image of completely exposing the fake rule, the fake authority that the Assyrians brought. And that's why I think we've got this additional image there. Verse 8 brings us with that another rhetorical question to something that I think is actually quite important for engaging the readers as well. Will you fare better? Will it go better with you than No Ammon? Do you know which city No Ammon is?
He says thieves.
Yes, it even translates thieves. Yes. So yes, the city of Thebes. I kept it with No Ammon. So No, the Egyptian word for city, or it's pronounced like this differently, I think, in Egyptian, but in Hebrew it goes as No. And sometimes Thebes is simply called a city. But Ammon is the key god worshipped there. So the city of Ammon is the fuller term for that city, which we call Thebes. What happened to Thebes? Thebes, dwelling at the streams, of course the streams of the Nile, that's not spelled out, but everyone knows that in the world, I imagine. Water surrounding her, because if you've been there or seen pictures, you know that the Nile is not just one big river. It's a massive river, of course, but often, and even more so in the ancient world than today, because today it's more managed and controlled, but it often goes into different arms, then separate and then come together again and separate again. So it's a very complex water landscape, and that's why Thebes, you've got several, in a sense, several arms of the river Nile around it. So it's like living on an island, and the protection is the sea, that you can't get to Noamon without conquering the sea. The sea is so, and it's probably, I think, punning here. On the one hand, sea is the water that surrounds her and forms a protection for her. It's difficult to conquer Thebes because of all the river running around. But also sea as a word for the Mediterranean Sea and for Upper Egypt, because Thebes was protected already by the fortresses in Upper Egypt that were making sure that no one would go up this way. Because in these days, you may know, Egypt was governed by the Cushites. They were under Nubian or Ethiopian control, governed from the south now. So the little, well, not so little, but the towns and the little rulers in the Nile Delta, they don't particularly like to be governed by the people in the south, but at that time, they were under the rule of the Cushites, and Thebes was the capital from which Egypt was ruled. So wonderful protection. Cush was her strength, because the whole of Egypt was governed by Cush. So south of Egypt, that region, your region, served as a protection. Egypt was there without limits, the whole of Egypt under one control. That was, if you know a little bit about Egyptian history, I don't have a picture of a pharaoh, I think, but the typical headdress of a pharaoh has the symbols for Upper and Lower Egypt, because that's always been one of the tricky ones. Upper Egypt in the Nile Delta, Upper and Lower Egypt were often in conflict with each other. And if you are a good, powerful ruler, that means you've got all under your control. So here, at this time, Egypt, they were all there under one control. Put and Libyans were against your helpers. Probably translating differently from the ESV here. What does the ESV say? Does anyone have the ESV ready for verse 9, 3:9, the second half? Yeah, so here in verse 9, there's this question about the Put and Libyans, on which side they are, depending on how you interpret the prepositions. So this is addressing Nineveh. Will you fare better than Noamon? Put and Libyans were against your helpers. That means the Assyrians had, of course, other nations to help them, but so did Egypt. They had Put and the Libyans, so North Africa, amongst their helpers as well. So they were hugely powerful, but she too was for exile, destined for exile, went into captivity, her children too being smashed at the head of every street, and for her public figures they cast lots, and all her dignitaries were bound in chains. So that happened in the 640s, that Thebes was conquered. And who did that? That is the key question, at what level you answer that. Because it was the Assyrian army. So if you ask that question, will you fare better than Noamon? If you are a proud Assyrian, you will say, yeah, of course we will. We conquered them. They were very powerful. We were more powerful. So what can happen to us? But Nahum turns this round, suggesting that, well, you are like Thebes, surrounded by water, lots of resources, lots of allies. Thebes couldn't stand, you won't either, because in the end, it wasn't you who conquered Thebes. It was God allowing you to conquer Thebes. And if God allows the Babylonians to conquer you, you're in the same boat as the Egyptians were. So that rhetorical question is therefore quite significant. Will you fare better than Noamon? Of course, Nahum expects the answer, no, you won't. It won't go better with you. Even they had all the resources, but were conquered. You too will become drunk. You will pass out. You too will seek a refuge from the enemy. All your fortifications are fig trees with first fruits. When they are shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater. So that's an imagery for how easy it will be to conquer your fortifications, like nicely ripe fig fruits. You just shake the tree a bit and it all comes down. You think you're so powerful. Well, when the time comes that God is determined for you to be conquered, it'll be easy game. Look, your people are women in your midst. For your enemies, wide open are the gates of your land. Fire has consumed your bars. Going back to the actual conquest, again, a clever use of poetry, quite a daring use of poetry, I think, with the wide open being used to look in both ways. Look, your people are women in your midst. So the first statement is, as elsewhere in the Bible, when it comes to military force, women are a sign of weakness, because women are not supposed to be engaged in war. That's men's business. And if you say that your people are women, then you're saying they're not proper soldiers. But then you think about the women. Your women in your midst, for your enemies, wide open. Now, having heard all the prostitution language, then that is quite saucy language, using the word order in this way, that you can read these women becoming all available for your enemies. But then where he lands on, wide open are the gates of your land. Yes, welcome, enemy. Doors wide open. Conquer us. Fire has consumed your bars. In other words, you can't lock the door anymore. The bars that were put forward to lock the doors, they're burned. Draw for yourself water for the siege. Here's the image. Reinforce your fortifications now quick. And we've seen archaeological evidence that's actually what they literally did. With the main wall is stones, masonry stones, but then they quickly produced some additional fortifications with clay and mortar. How would you do that? I wish I had a picture for that. Because ancient walls often run in two parallel courses. And so there's a bit of a space in between them. And if there's no warfare, that space in the gates in particular then is used for negotiating business. And so that's where judgment happens. But it's that space that is being filled now by the Assyrians with additional clay mortar. And they're trying to prevent, because they're quite wide gates. As I say, Nineveh was designed to be a show-off city. Those walls with huge gates were to show how majestic they were. Now, huge gates is great to symbolize majesty and strength. It's not so great if you've got an enemy coming. You would want your gates to be a little bit smaller so they can't just run into it. And that's what they try to do then, having additional brickwork there so that the enemy couldn't just run through with chariots or whatever, with the horses as quickly. Take hold of the brickwork, but of course, Nahum says, as it happens, this will all be useless. There, right there, when you're trying to reinforce your fortifications, fire will consume you, a sword will cut you down, it will consume you like grasshoppers. And it was actually fire that destroyed the city, and we can tell that from the archaeology. The archaeology in Nineveh is, in a sense, more straightforward than in many other places, because Nineveh was never properly rebuilt. It's now surrounded by Mosul and so on, but it was completely destroyed and then left. So that means easy job for archaeologists. The first level is the destruction layer of the city. If you wanted to find out about the destruction of, say, Jerusalem in the 6th century, you've got the problem that Jerusalem was rebuilt many times since then, was destroyed in 70 AD as well. So you've got to dig through all these layers before you get anywhere near to the 6th century. You can do it, it's more work. And if you ever get a chance to go to Jerusalem, have a look at the burnt house and so on, where you can see the damage that the Babylonians did to the then wall of Jerusalem. And so archaeology in Nineveh a bit easier, because you just go to the latest level, and then you've got this destruction layer, and you see the fire and the skeletons. And I think I saw them first at that conference that I mentioned on Nineveh. The archaeologists showed pictures of those skeletons in the gates lying down, and the chaos of it. So really bodies upon bodies. And I'm playing on the idea of grasshoppers, familiar from Joel. It will consume you like grasshoppers, as you know much better in Africa than we know in Europe. When you've got a swarm of grasshoppers coming, that can be devastating. And within an hour or two, a region looks completely different from what it looked before. So that's why it's used as an imagery, as an image for complete destruction. It will consume you like grasshoppers. But then it's playing with that imagery, growing heavy like grasshoppers, eating, proliferate like locusts, because one of the troubles is that they quickly proliferate, and so you've got these huge swarms of locusts. And that's what you've done, Nineveh. You have multiplied your merchants more than the stars in the skies. But grasshoppers shed their skin and fly. Your courtiers are like a locust swarm, and your officials like a horde of locusts. They are camping in the walls on a cold day. The sun rises, and it has disappeared, and its place is unknown. Where are they? So first, the imagery of grasshoppers is used for the complete devastation they can cause to a land. But then the other thing about grasshoppers is they're very quickly gone as well. Once they've eaten everything, then they can be very quickly gone as well, because there's nothing more to eat. And then the poet uses that imagery as well. Look, all those merchants you had, all those many people that were in your employ, but imagine like the British Empire conquering the world left, right, and center, and the East India Company comes with them, and the merchants exploit that. So all that conquest is for economic exploitation, or at least economic exploitation goes in the wake of all this. But when they see how the wind is turning, the sun rises, they say, oh, goodbye, Assyria, nothing to do with you anymore, and they're gone. Like a horde of locusts, quickly gone. The sun rises, and the whole horde has disappeared. Its place is unknown. Where are they? All that's left is the destruction they've caused. And then it ends by putting responsibilities on the leaders. Again, your shepherds slumber, king of Assyria. That's a surprising, interesting use of shepherds here, because shepherd is usually used for the king. So here it's used for the officials. Your shepherds slumber, king of Assyria. Your officers are at rest. Yeah, they're just sleeping on the job. Your people are scattered on the mountains, and there's no one to gather them. There's no relief for your fracture. Your injury is severe. going back to the motive of messengers and news that we've had twice before, all that hear the news about you clap their hands over you. Wonderful news. Nineveh has fallen, for who has not been overwhelmed by your evil continually? And so that final verse also reminds us that Nahum is not speaking as a Judean nationalist, and finally we are liberated, and so on. He's also mindful of all these other nations, all that hear the news about you. So many people have been impacted by the Assyrian conquest. Like when a great empire falls, there are lots of smaller communities and countries that breathe a sigh of relief. So we've seen, maybe use those pictures now to summarize where we've got to. A pronouncement concerning Nineveh that leads us to the first poem, that leads us to the question, what do you ponder concerning the Lord? Because that's the key question. What's your perspective of who God is? And that's the question to which we need to return now in a moment. Is God this God who does these violent things? So Nineveh becomes smaller when you look at God. Oh, I'd forgotten about that. I tried in English to suggest an imitation of how the alphabetic acrostic works, so that's a useful reminder now. Of course, English is left to right. As I've discovered, is Amharic. And as I mentioned, so that's wrong. Semitic languages in my mind are always right to left. So why is Amharic written left to right? Anyway, so we are used to left to right. So we have Ani, the I am the Lord. We've got twice the divine name, followed by A-B, and these first two letters are repeated. Then we've got the letter C in English, translating it into English. Then the letter D is withered away. Then we've got the letter E and F. Then before G comes the word before. Then we have H and I. And then we have two lines that refer to the end. And say, okay, we're not expecting this to continue. So this in brief shows why I think there's more to it than just a coincidence with that. It shows us God as in control, fully, and always, slow to anger. He's patient, but not powerless. That patience can be mistaken for powerlessness. He's strong in power. He's characterized by rage against his enemies. That's his very character, to be opposed to evil. Jealousy guards and defends what belongs to him. And we could talk about jealousy and the importance of that, because that is often another thing that people struggle with. Jealousy is a bad thing, isn't it? Why is God allowed to be jealous? Well, jealousy is about who someone is and the right of someone. So if you're the husband, you've got a wife, and someone else pretends that they are the husband of your wife, you've got a right to be jealous. Most of our jealousy is wrong, but hello, I am the husband. And so in big picture, God is jealous for being God. There's only one person who can fill the role of God really well. And so everyone else who fills that role is going to mess things up dramatically. So if you make the Assyrians your God, you're in trouble. If you make some Marduk, Assyrian God, your God, you're in trouble, because that needs to... And because God doesn't want us to be in trouble, he said, this is my role. No one is allowed to fill that role of God, because I am the only one who can fill that role and do it really well. None of us is going to do a good job at it. So don't even try. Let God be God is what his jealousy is about, because it's good for us